Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where candlelight trembles against stone walls, where history breathes warm and close, and where family trees twist so tightly they begin to fold back into themselves. You're not sitting at a desk or staring at a screen anymore, you're drifting down a long corridor of time, barefoot on cool marble, listening to secrets echo behind doors that were never meant to be opened. This is one of those nights where the past doesn't feel distant or academic, but intimate and unsettling, like you've wandered into a conversation that stopped the moment you arrived. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this story with your innocence completely intact. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together here on Timeless Sleep. You move forward gently, almost reluctantly, because the story waiting for you isn't loud or violent or dramatic in the way movies like to pretend history always was. Instead, it's slow, it's deliberate. It's made of decisions repeated so many times they began to feel normal to the people making them. You realise early on that this isn't a tale of passion or romance as we understand it, but of power. Power that demanded preservation at any cost. Long before laws, before modern medicine, before words like genetics meant anything at all, rulers believed blood was not just symbolic, but sacred. Blood was legitimacy. Blood was heaven's signature written inside the body, and if that blood mixed with outsiders, it diluted the message. So families closed in on themselves, generation after generation, convincing themselves that the closer the blood, the closer they were to the divine. As you wander deeper into this idea, it starts to feel less like a single shocking practice and more like a mindset, one that quietly infected royal households across continents. You picture parents teaching their children that the world beyond palace walls was dangerous, impure, chaotic, that only within the family could order survive. Marriage then wasn't about love or choice, it was architecture, a way to stack stones so the tower wouldn't fall, and when siblings were paired together, it wasn't whispered about as something forbidden, it was spoken of as necessity. The people involved grew up knowing no alternative. From childhood, they were told their destiny slept just down the hallway, behind a door that belonged to someone who shared their same mother, their same lessons, their same toys. You pause for a moment in this mental corridor, because something about that feels heavier than scandal. There's a loneliness there that history books rarely mention. Imagine being born into a life where your future partner is already determined before you can speak, where your role in the world is decided not by who you are, but by who you came from. You begin to sense that many of these marriages weren't fueled by desire, but by resignation. Duty layered on top of duty until it felt like gravity. And gravity, once strong enough, stops being questioned. The earliest civilizations leaned into this belief with remarkable confidence. In places where rulers were seen not merely as kings or queens, but as living gods, the rules of ordinary humanity simply did not apply. If gods married gods, then siblings marrying siblings wasn't corruption, it was imitation of the cosmos. The sky married the earth. The sun reunited with itself each dawn. Myths blurred into lore, and lore into ritual. Over time, what might once have shocked became ceremonial. Weddings were staged not as celebrations of union, but as reaffirmations of order. Crowns passed hands not because of merit, but because the bloodline must remain unbroken, no matter how fragile it became. As you listen, your breathing slows. The story isn't rushing you. It's asking you to sit with the discomfort rather than recoil from it. You begin to understand that these choices weren't made by monsters twirling moustaches in candlelight. They were made by people convinced the world would collapse if they did anything else. Fear hides beneath the gold leaf and silk robes, fear of rebellion, fear of losing divine favour, fear that without sacred blood they were just ordinary humans pretending to rule. You notice how repetition becomes its own kind of trap. Once one generation does it, the next inherits not only the throne, but the justification. By the time centuries pass, no one remembers why the rule began, only that breaking it feels impossible. And so brothers marry sisters, uncles marry nieces, cousins marry cousins until the family tree stops branching and starts circling. From the outside it looks grotesque. From the inside it feels inevitable. There's a strange stillness to this realization, the kind that settles over you late at night when you realize how easily humans normalize almost anything if it's wrapped in tradition. You think about how rituals can turn choices into obligations, how language can soften reality. These marriages weren't described as incest. They were described as purity, as continuity, as divine maintenance. Words doing quiet work behind the scenes. Somewhere in your mind, you picture grand halls filled with portraits, faces painted to appear serene, symmetrical, eternal. But you start to sense the effort behind those images. Artists smoothing features, chroniclers choosing polite phrasing, entire courts participating in a collective agreement not to look too closely. Because to acknowledge the cost would be to admit the system itself was flawed. And yet, beneath the silence, the cost accumulated. Children were born fragile, illness lingered, tempers flared, minds dimmed or fractured under pressure no one understood. But without science, without explanation, these outcomes were interpreted as fate, or punishment, or divine mystery. Never as consequence, never as cause and effect. The idea that blood could betray itself had not yet entered human thought. You walk further, the corridor narrowing slightly, the air warmer now, heavy with incense and whispers. This story isn't about one family or one culture. It's about a pattern humans repeated wherever power and fear intertwined. Across deserts and mountains, in palaces carved from stone or raised in wood, the same logic took root. Protect the blood, preserve the line, marry within, again and again. There's something almost hypnotic about it, the way certainty replaces curiosity. Once leaders believed they were chosen by heaven, questioning their customs became unthinkable. To oppose a royal marriage was to oppose the gods themselves, and so entire populations adjusted their morality accordingly. What would have been forbidden for common people became exalted for rulers. The same act, judged by two entirely different standards, depending on who performed it. You feel the weight of that double reality pressing gently on your chest as you lie listening. History begins to feel less like a sequence of events, and more like a long dream humanity had about itself. A dream where blood meant destiny, where lineage outweighed compassion, where love was optional, but continuity was sacred. And still, within all of this, you sense the individuals trapped inside the system. Young princes and princesses raised together, taught to bow to each other before they understood why. Shared childhood laughter slowly turning into expectation. The moment when someone explains, softly, that their sibling is not just family, they are future. No room for refusal, no language for discomfort, just acceptance learned through repetition. You imagine how silence must have filled their nights, how ceremony replaced intimacy, how obligation stood in for affection. Some adapted, some broke quietly. Some left behind letters filled with restraint and coded sorrow. But history rarely preserves emotional truth, only outcomes. Only marriages recorded, only heirs counted. As the hours pass in this story space, you begin to understand why these unions persisted for so long. Not because people were ignorant or cruel, but because systems, once established, resist change with incredible force. When an empire rests on a belief, dismantling that belief feels more dangerous than enduring its harm. And so people choose the familiar pain over the unknown freedom. The corridor seems to stretch endlessly now, but your steps feel lighter, not because the story grows easier, but because you've adjusted to its rhythm. You're not here to judge or recoil, you're here to witness, to let the past unfold without modern arrogance, without pretending you would have known better if you'd been born into silk sheets and divine prophecy. You realise something quietly profound. History's most twisted marriages were rarely about desire. They were about fear wearing ceremonial robes, about humans mistaking control for stability, about families trying to freeze time by folding inward instead of growing outward. And as the torchlight flickers along the walls, you sense that this is only the beginning. You haven't yet reached the dynasties whose names still echo today, the faces reproduced in museums, the stories that feel almost fictional in their strangeness. You're still standing at the threshold, learning the logic that made everything else possible. The air hums softly, like the past breathing in its sleep. You slow your steps, letting the weight of it settle without panic. There's no rush. The night is long, the story is patient, and you, listening in the dark, are exactly where you're meant to be. You drift forward, and the stone beneath your feet warms, as if the sun itself has soaked into it for thousands of years. The air changes here, drier, older, humming with insects you can't see. The corridor opens into something vast and open, and suddenly you're standing beneath a sky so blue it almost hurts to look at, a sky that once convinced people it was alive. This is where the idea of sacred blood didn't just exist, it crystallized. Along the Nile, where floods arrived like clockwork and crops rose obediently from black soil, order felt divine. And when nature obeyed patterns, humans assumed power should too. So rulers didn't merely govern Egypt, they embodied it. They were not chosen by the gods, they were the gods, walking slowly in human skin. You feel how that belief presses down on everything. It's in the temples aligned with stars, in the statues staring forward without blinking, in the silence people kept when the royal family passed by, eyes lowered, breath held. If a pharaoh was divine, then his family was divine by extension, and divinity, in this worldview, could not mix freely with the ordinary. To marry outside the royal house wasn't romance, it was contamination. So the family folded inward, again and again, convinced they were preserving the universe itself. Here, sibling marriage wasn't hidden or whispered, it was ritualized, celebrated, written into theology. Brothers married sisters not because they loved them, but because the gods in their myths did the same. The story of divine siblings intertwining was carved into walls long before any human wedding took place. When rulers imitated those gods, they weren't breaking taboos, they were reenacting creation. You can almost hear priests explaining it in calm, patient voices. The royal blood must remain whole, just as the sun returns to itself each dawn. You imagine growing up inside that certainty. From infancy, royal children were taught they were different. Not better in a moral sense, simply separate. Their bodies mattered in ways others did not. Their marriages were not personal milestones, but cosmic maintenance. To refuse would be to risk chaos. Floods might fail, crops might rot, the Nile itself might turn away. When the fate of the world is placed on your shoulders, consent becomes a very quiet thing. As you move deeper into this imagined Egypt, the palaces feel less luxurious and more ceremonial. Everything exists for continuity. Children are raised with tutors, rituals, prayers, and inevitability. They learn their lineage before they learn themselves. When a brother and sister reach adulthood, the union is announced as naturally as the changing of seasons. There is feasting, music, incense curling upward, but beneath it all sits something still and heavy, like stone waiting patiently beneath sand. You think about how this system sustained itself for centuries, Dynasties rose and fell, but the principle endured. Royal women held astonishing power here compared to many other ancient cultures. Queens ruled beside kings, sometimes even alone. And yet, that power came with confinement. A royal daughter might command armies in theory, but she still existed within the blood circle. Her womb was political territory, her marriage a theological decision. The idea of love, as you understand it, barely enters the picture. Affection may have existed, familiarity certainly did. But love wasn't the purpose. Stability was, continuity was, eternity imagined and chased through repetition. The Egyptians believed the afterlife mirrored the living world, and so preserving order in life meant preserving it forever. Even death did not release a pharaoh from his role. He ruled eternally beyond the horizon. So his bloodline had to reflect perfection, unbroken and enclosed. You pause beside the river in your mind, watching it slide past without urgency. It's easy to see how convincing this worldview would have been. When the same family rules for generations, when monuments rise and remain, when floods arrive on schedule, tradition begins to feel like proof, and proof becomes justification. No one is asking whether sibling marriage is right or wrong. The only question is whether it works. And for a long time it seems to. But beneath the golden ritual, something quieter unfolds. Children are born who do not thrive. Illness lingers in royal households. Some heirs die young, others rule briefly before fading. The records describe these events gently, almost politely. Never as warnings, always as mysteries. The gods work in ways humans cannot question. And so the pattern continues, uninterrupted. You sense how normalized everything becomes. Servants whisper only behind walls, priests reassure, scribes write carefully, the truth is softened into metaphor. What might have alarmed another culture becomes absorbed here, diluted by belief. After all, if the pharaoh is divine, how could his blood betray him? There is something haunting in that question. Because you, listening now, know what they couldn't. You know about inheritance and chance and fragile sequences passed from parent to child. But they lived without that lens. To them, the body was spiritual terrain, not biological machinery. When something went wrong, it wasn't blamed on repetition, it was interpreted as destiny. You walk past statues depicting royal couples with identical features, faces symmetrical and serene. The art itself reinforces the idea of unity. Two figures, nearly mirror images, seated side by side. Husband and wife, brother and sister, god and goddess. Even in stone, individuality dissolves. What matters is the pair, the balance, the echo. And yet, history leaves hints, quiet ones. Letters praising queens for strength when they ruled alone. Records noting co-regencies, corrections, unusual arrangements. These suggest moments when reality strained against tradition, when perhaps a ruler hesitated, when perhaps someone sensed that divine isolation came at a cost. But those moments rarely lasted. The system was too old, too sanctified to dismantle easily. You imagine the pressure inside the palace, the expectation to produce heirs, and not just any heirs, but perfect ones. The anxiety hidden behind formal smiles, the ceremonies marking pregnancies, births, deaths. Each child not just loved, but evaluated. Not in cruelty, but necessity. The throne must continue. The gods must be appeased. As the night deepens, the Nile glows faintly under moonlight. You feel how time moves differently here. Centuries blur together. Dynasties stack like layers of sand. Each one believing they were the final, eternal version. Each one repeating the same logic with absolute confidence. What lingers most isn't shock, it's stillness. A civilization so certain of its cosmic role that it couldn't imagine alternatives. The practice of sibling marriage endured not because no one questioned it, but because questioning felt dangerous. When belief is entwined with survival, doubt becomes treason. You think about how this isolation shaped identity. When your world contains only your family, your court, your rituals, your gods, perspective shrinks. Outsiders become abstractions. The bloodline becomes reality itself. Protecting it feels like protecting existence. And yet, even here, humanity slips through the cracks. You sense tenderness in some depictions, a hand resting lightly on another's knee in carved relief, a shared gaze in a painted tomb. Whether love grew from proximity or simply companionship, it existed alongside obligation. Humans adapt, even inside systems they did not choose. Still, adaptation doesn't mean freedom. Many royal lives unfolded along predetermined paths, measured in ceremonies rather than choices. Childhood, marriage, rulership, death, each step scripted long before the individual arrived. As you continue walking, the sun dips lower, shadows stretching across temples. The grandeur remains, but you begin to see its fragility. No matter how divine the claim, the rulers were still human. Their bodies aged, their minds faltered, their blood remembered every repetition, even if their beliefs did not. The practice that once symbolized purity slowly became a quiet liability. But it would take many centuries, and the collision of cultures, empires, and new ways of thinking, before that realization surfaced. For now, in this moment of ancient calm, the system still holds. The river flows, the crowns shine, the gods seem satisfied. You breathe slowly, letting the heat fade as night settles. The world here believes itself eternal, and maybe that belief alone carried it longer than reason ever could. You step onward, knowing this pattern will reappear elsewhere, reshaped, renamed, justified differently, but always echoing this same ancient desire to keep power safe by keeping it close. The sand whispers softly behind you as the story moves on. You move forward, and the air tightens again, no longer dry and ceremonial but tense, buzzing with ambition. The calm certainty of ancient tradition begins to fracture here, replaced by urgency, by politics moving faster than belief can keep up with. You are still in Egypt, but now it's an Egypt leaning toward the edge of something enormous, pulled between its ancient self and the looming shadow of foreign power. The palaces feel louder. The corridors echo with arguments instead of prayers. This is where the old logic of sibling marriage collides with desperation, and where one family twists itself into knots trying to survive the end of an era. You feel it immediately in the household of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty ruling Egypt while pretending to be fully Egyptian. They inherited not only a throne, but an identity they had to perform. To rule the Nile, they adopted its gods, its rituals, and its customs, including the tradition of marrying within the family. What began as imitation hardened into obsession. Brother married sister, generation after generation, until the practice no longer symbolized divinity so much as control. Power stayed close. Rivals stayed distant. Trust, such as it was, existed only among those who shared blood. You sense how unstable it all feels beneath the surface. This is not the serene eternity of the old pharaohs. This is a dynasty constantly looking over its shoulder. Assassinations are common, exiles frequent. Children are raised knowing siblings may one day be spouses or enemies, sometimes both. The family doesn't just share blood, it shares paranoia. By the time you reach Cleopatra's generation, the pattern has become almost unbearable. She is born into a house where violence is routine and alliances are temporary. Fathers kill sons, sisters poison brothers. Royal dinners are as dangerous as battlefields. And still, the old rule remains: marry within. Preserve the line. Maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the people, even if the people no longer fully believe. You watch Cleopatra grow up speaking multiple languages, absorbing politics as easily as air. She is brilliant, calculating, and painfully aware that survival requires adaptability. But no amount of intelligence frees her from tradition. When she ascends the throne, she does so beside her younger brother, as custom demands. Their marriage is not romantic, not even symbolic, it is contractual. Two names bound together on official decrees, two bodies sharing a crown neither fully controls. The imbalance is obvious. He is a child, she is a strategist. But tradition does not care about maturity or compatibility. It cares only about appearance. Coins are minted with both faces. Documents list them as equals. In reality, the palace fractures almost immediately. Advisors manipulate. Courtiers choose sides. The marriage becomes a battlefield disguised as ritual. You feel the claustrophobia of it. Imagine ruling a kingdom while legally bound to someone you cannot trust. Someone whose very existence threatens your power simply by breathing. Cleopatra's story is often told as one of romance and spectacle. But here, in this moment, it is something colder. A woman navigating a system designed to consume her. The sibling bond, already strained by politics, becomes poisonous under expectation. The marriage offers no intimacy, only surveillance. Every gesture is watched, every decision interpreted. When conflict erupts, it does so violently. Cleopatra is forced into exile by the very court meant to support her. Her brother's faction claims legitimacy through tradition, through the marriage itself. The ancient rule that once protected dynasties now becomes a weapon. You sense how the old belief is cracking. The idea that sibling marriage guarantees stability no longer holds. Instead, it multiplies danger. Rival heirs are too close. Resentments too personal. Power struggles too intimate. When siblings marry, betrayal cuts deeper because it begins at the family table. Cleopatra eventually returns, not because tradition saves her, but because she learns to operate outside it. She allies with Rome. She understands that Egypt's future no longer rests solely in ancient customs, and in doing so, she quietly breaks the spell that held her ancestors captive. The marriage remains on paper, but its meaning dissolves. Politics overtakes theology, yet even as she adapts, she cannot fully escape the system she was born into. Her brother dies under mysterious circumstances, as so many Ptolemies did. Another younger brother becomes her next co-ruler, and again tradition demands marriage. Again, the ritual is performed. Again, it feels hollow. By now it's less about belief and more about performance, an echo of something that once felt sacred. You realise that this is what decline looks like, not sudden collapse, but repetition without faith. Customs continue long after their meaning has eroded. People go through motions because stopping would mean admitting the past no longer works. Cleopatra's reign sits at the crossroads of ancient certainty and modern politics. She is both the final product of incestuous royal tradition and the first to truly move beyond it. Her story exposes the cost of centuries spent turning inward. The dynasty is brilliant, educated, wealthy, and profoundly unstable. Too much closeness has bred rivalry instead of unity. As you linger with her story, you feel the emotional toll more than the scandal. Raised among siblings who could become spouses, enemies, or executioners, trust becomes a luxury. Affection becomes risky. Even childhood bonds are politicized. Love, if it appears at all, must fight through layers of suspicion. The palace atmosphere grows thick with anticipation. Rome's influence increases. Egypt's autonomy weakens. The old system cannot protect against empire. The sacred bloodline, once believed invincible, proves fragile in the face of global power. And suddenly, the logic of sibling marriage, preserve control by keeping it close, reveals its fatal flaw. It works only in isolation. The moment the world expands, it collapses inward. Cleopatra herself becomes mythologized, her relationships sensationalized, her intelligence simplified into seduction. But beneath the legend stands a woman shaped by one of history's most suffocating family structures. Her ability to maneuver politically is not accidental, it is survival instinct, honed from childhood inside a dynasty, where affection and danger shared the same room. You begin to understand something subtle here. Sibling marriage didn't merely affect genetics or succession, it shaped psychology. It trained rulers to see intimacy as transactional, family as strategy, trust as weakness. When every relationship carries political weight, vulnerability becomes nearly impossible. By the time Egypt falls fully under Roman control, the tradition fades not with outrage, but exhaustion. The world has changed too much. New rulers bring new frameworks. Blood no longer defines divinity. Power migrates outward instead of inward. The ancient circle finally breaks, not because it is condemned, but because it is obsolete. You stand at the edge of this moment, watching an ancient practice dissolve into history. It doesn't end with scandal or proclamation. It simply stops being useful. And that, you realise, is often how traditions truly die. The Nile keeps flowing, the temples remain, but something essential has shifted. The belief that family must close in on itself to survive has been challenged by reality itself. Egypt's long experiment with divine isolation reaches its quiet conclusion. As you step away from Cleopatra's world, the echoes linger, of brilliance constrained by tradition, of power undermined by proximity, of a dynasty that believed closeness meant strength until it nearly tore itself apart. The corridor ahead darkens again, preparing you for lands far from the Nile, where the same idea will reappear in unfamiliar forms. Different gods, different crowns, the same dangerous hope that blood, if kept pure enough, might defy time. You drift onward, and the air grows perfumed, thick with oils and smoke, heavy with sweetness meant to mask something sour beneath it. This part of the palace feels intimate, almost domestic, yet strangely artificial, as if every surface has been polished not for comfort but for presentation. Here, power is no longer proclaimed through monuments or divine decrees alone, but through appearance, through skin, scent, posture, and ritual. You sense that as dynasties age, they begin to obsess not only over blood, but over how that blood is displayed. You walk through chambers where mirrors gleam softly in torchlight, where servants move silently with trays of ointments and powders. Royal bodies are no longer simply vessels of divinity, they are symbols that must appear flawless. Smooth skin suggests favour from the gods. Youth signals legitimacy. Beauty becomes propaganda. And so an entire culture of preservation develops, one meant to hold decay at bay just a little longer. Within families already closed tightly together, this obsession deepens. When siblings marry siblings, familiarity erodes mystery, and ritual must replace romance. Perfumes become language, cosmetics become armour. The body is curated as carefully as the bloodline itself. Every detail matters, because the illusion of perfection is part of maintaining authority. You begin to feel how exhausting this must have been. The pressure to embody eternity while living inside a fragile human body. Royals are not allowed to age naturally. Wrinkles, scars, blemishes, these are failures of image. So layers are applied, mixtures blended from minerals, plants and animal products. Some soothe, some irritate, some quietly poison, but no one questions them because they are tradition now, passed down alongside crowns and wedding contracts. The irony settles gently over you. Families so obsessed with purity unknowingly coat themselves in substances far more harmful than any outsider ever could be. Yet the danger is invisible, masked by fragrance and routine. Much like the marriages themselves, the damage accumulates slowly, politely, almost politely enough to ignore. In these spaces, sibling couples live side by side not as lovers but as symbols. Public appearances are choreographed. Private life is tightly managed. Servants see everything, but say nothing. The palace becomes a theatre where intimacy is replaced by performance. Even rest feels ceremonial. You imagine nights when queens lie awake, skin still sticky with oils meant to preserve youth, listening to the breathing of a sibling turned spouse nearby. The closeness is unavoidable, yet emotionally distant. They share ancestry, not choice. Destiny, not desire. And over time, the body becomes just another political object, to be adorned, controlled, prepared for display. This emphasis on surface reflects a deeper fear. When bloodlines repeat too often, unpredictability increases. Illness appears without warning. Behaviour becomes erratic. The response is not understanding, but concealment. Makeup hides pallor. Jewellery distracts from tremors. Ritual distracts from instability. History records elaborate beauty routines in royal courts not merely as vanity, but as necessity. To appear strong was to remain strong. To appear divine was to maintain belief, and belief, once shaken, could bring everything crashing down. You feel how these practices blur the boundary between care and control. What begins as self-preservation turns into obligation. A queen cannot decide to stop. A king cannot appear unadorned. Their bodies no longer belong to themselves. They belong to the dynasty. Within sibling marriages, this loss of bodily autonomy feels even sharper. The same people who shared childhood now monitor each other as political assets. Pregnancy is tracked. Fertility scrutinized. Failure to produce heirs becomes accusation. Success becomes relief, not joy. You sense how isolation deepens. Outsiders are dangerous, but insiders are unavoidable. When conflict arises, there is no distance to retreat into, no neutral ground. Disagreements echo through shared blood and shared pasts, making resolution nearly impossible. And still, the rituals continue. Oil on skin, incense in halls, paint on lips. All of it whispers the same message: remain perfect, remain untouched by time, remain worthy of rule. As if aesthetics could compensate for structural decay. You think about how humans often respond to fear, not by addressing its source, but by tightening control elsewhere. When dynasties felt instability creeping in, they didn't loosen their grip, they clenched harder. More tradition, more repetition, more enclosure. The same response that caused the strain is applied as the solution. The palace becomes quieter in your imagination now. Not peaceful, but restrained. Laughter exists, but softly. Affection, but cautiously. Everyone senses that something is wrong, but no one can name it without threatening everything they know. Over generations, the cost becomes emotional as much as physical. Children grow up surrounded by adults who model restraint instead of warmth. Love becomes formal. Praise becomes conditional. Even grief is regulated, scheduled between ceremonies. You feel how this environment shapes people into roles rather than individuals. A sister is never just a sister. A brother is never just a brother. Each relationship carries layered meaning that cannot be escaped. Even private thoughts feel disloyal. The obsession with beauty and presentation extends beyond the living. Death does not end performance. Bodies are preserved, painted, posed. Eternity is curated. The illusion of perfection must survive even decay itself. There is something haunting about that. The refusal to allow imperfection even in death. As if acknowledging decay would unravel the story they told themselves for centuries. You linger in this part of the journey, sensing the quiet tragedy beneath the grandeur. Not scandal, not horror, but exhaustion. An entire system running on repetition long after its participants have stopped believing it brings safety. The sibling marriages persist here, not because anyone finds them comforting, but because abandoning them would require admitting uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing absolute power cannot tolerate. As time passes, The rituals become heavier, more elaborate, compensating for belief that grows thinner each generation. What once felt sacred now feels obligatory. What once connected rulers to gods now binds them to routines they no longer understand. You step back and see the pattern clearly. When bloodlines close in on themselves, creativity withers. Adaptability shrinks. The world outside evolves while the palace circles endlessly within its own reflection. And yet, from inside the system, this circling feels safe, familiar, predictable. The unknown beyond the walls feels far more terrifying than the known damage within them. The perfumes thicken, the torches dim. The mirrors reflect faces that look calm but carry invisible strain. You sense that these beauty rituals, these carefully maintained surfaces, are not signs of confidence. They are defences against fear. Fear of time, fear of change, fear that the gods might turn away if tradition falters. As you move onward, the scent fades gradually, replaced by cooler air. You leave behind the chambers of oils and mirrors, carrying with you the understanding that sometimes the most elaborate traditions exist not to honour life, but to delay confronting its limits. The corridor stretches again, preparing you for lands where sibling marriage will appear under new banners, no longer divine, but dynastic, justified not by gods but by blood rights and royal entitlement. And as you walk, you feel the night settling deeper around you, steady and patient, ready to unfold the next echo of the same ancient mistake. You move onward, and the world reshapes itself again, the heat of Egypt fading into thin mountain air that makes every breath feel deliberate. The ground rises beneath you until clouds drift below your feet, and suddenly you're standing high in the Andes, where the sky feels close enough to touch, and the sun dominates everything. Here, power does not flow from rivers or stone temples, but from light itself. The sun is not merely worshipped, it is family. And in this world, lineage is not traced back to gods metaphorically, but literally. The rulers claim descent from the sun, and because the sun cannot mix with the ordinary, neither can its children. You feel how absolute this belief is. The Inca emperor is not simply chosen by divine favour, he is born from it. His blood is considered solar, radiant, fundamentally different from that of common people. To allow that blood to mingle freely would be unthinkable. It would dim the sun itself. And so, once again, the solution is closeness. The royal family turns inward, preserving what they believe is cosmic balance through sibling marriage. Here, the emperor's principal wife is expected to be his full sister, not a cousin, not a distant relative, a sister of the same parents, carrying the same sacred origin. This pairing is not optional or symbolic. It is the foundation of legitimacy. Any children born from this union are considered the purest heirs, the ones closest to the sun's essence. Other wives may exist, but they are secondary. Their children are acknowledged, sometimes even powerful, but never quite equal. You sense how carefully this hierarchy is maintained. Every relationship has rank. Every birth has meaning. The empire stretches vast across mountains and valleys, yet its authority rests on something incredibly fragile, the belief that one family's blood is different from all others. From childhood, royal siblings are raised with this destiny quietly surrounding them. They are taught that they are not like the rest of the world, that their bodies carry responsibility as much as privilege. They learn rituals honouring the sun, ceremonies marking its movements, prayers synchronized with light itself. Their identities are shaped less by personality and more by symbolism. As they grow older, the inevitability settles in. The sister is not simply family, she is future empress. The brother is not simply kin, he is destined ruler. Their bond is shaped from infancy to accommodate this outcome. Familiarity replaces choice. Expectation replaces consent. By the time marriage arrives, it feels less like a decision and more like the final step of a long process already in motion. You feel the quiet pressure of it, the way destiny becomes heavy when it is never questioned. Refusal is not rebellion alone, it is cosmic disruption. If the sun's children fail to reflect its unity, the harmony of the world itself might fracture. Crops could fail, enemies could triumph, disaster could follow. The burden placed on two human bodies becomes immense. The wedding itself is magnificent. Gold glints everywhere, catching sunlight in dazzling flashes, feathers shimmer. Priests chant. The union is framed not as intimacy but as alignment, two halves of divine origin restored to balance. The empire watches, reassured. Order continues. Yet behind the spectacle, the same quiet human realities exist. The couple knows each other too well. Shared childhood memories blur boundaries. Arguments echo with years of familiarity. There is little mystery, little space to retreat. And as always, the marriage is watched, not for happiness, but for productivity. The Empress's primary duty is to bear the next son-child. Her body becomes sacred territory, monitored and revered. Fertility rituals surround her. Every pregnancy is anticipated with reverence and fear. A healthy heir strengthens the empire. A loss unsettles it. You notice how compassion exists here, but only within limits. When tragedy strikes, grief is acknowledged, but quickly reframed as divine will. The system cannot linger on pain. It must continue forward. The sun does not pause, and neither can its descendants. Unlike Egypt's long centuries of repetition, the Inca system feels sharper, more intense. The empire expands rapidly, conquering vast regions, absorbing countless peoples. And yet, the ruling family remains sealed at the centre, untouched by assimilation. Outsiders may serve, fight, worship, but never fully join. This separation reinforces sibling marriage rather than weakening it. The more diverse the empire becomes, the more the rulers cling to sameness within their own house. Difference exists everywhere else. Unity must exist at the top. You sense how lonely that must feel. To stand above millions, yet belong fully to only a handful. To rule an empire while emotionally confined to a single family circle. As the generations pass, the tradition persists not because it is questioned, but because it works, until it doesn't. The empire thrives for a time. Roads spread. Cities rise. Administration becomes sophisticated. From the outside, it looks like proof that divine blood ensures success. But success masks fragility. When succession crises emerge, they cut deeply. Rival brothers, often sons of secondary wives, contest the throne. Bloodlines blur despite efforts to keep them pure. Civil wars erupt. And suddenly, closeness becomes conflict. The sibling marriage that was meant to stabilize succession cannot prevent rivalry, it only concentrates it. When disputes arise, they do so within the family, turning personal grievances into national disasters. You feel the tension building toward the empire's final years. Two brothers, both claiming legitimacy, tear the state apart. The sacred bloodline fractures from within. And into that fracture step outsiders who do not share the old beliefs. Conquistadors armed not with solar lineage, but with steel, disease, and ruthless opportunism. The sun does not protect its children from this new world. The old logic collapses almost instantly under forces it was never designed to face. The rituals, the lineage, the sibling marriages, none of it prepares the empire for an enemy that does not believe in the sun's authority. When the Inca world falls, it does so shockingly fast. Not because the system was weak, but because it was inflexible. It could not adapt. It could not imagine a reality where blood was not destiny. You stand in the aftermath, among temples stripped of gold, ceremonies silenced, royal families broken apart. The sibling marriage tradition ends not through reform, but through collapse. The belief that sustained it vanishes with the empire itself. Yet its echo lingers. The idea that power must remain within the family does not die here. It simply migrates across oceans, into castles, into coats of arms and royal decrees. The gods change, the justification shifts, but the impulse remains. As you leave the mountains behind, you carry with you the image of a people who believed unity could be engineered through blood, who tied cosmic order to human reproduction, and who paid the price when the world expanded beyond their imagination. The night deepens again, the air grows cooler, and somewhere ahead you sense crowns waiting, not blessed by sons or gods, but claimed by inheritance alone. You continue forward, and the world feels quieter now, as though the mountains themselves have swallowed their echoes. The certainty that once wrapped empires in divine assurance begins to soften here, replaced by something more fragile, belief maintained not by gods alone, but by fear of what happens without them. This is the moment where sacred blood is no longer just honoured, but anxiously guarded. The rituals remain, the language persists, but beneath it all you sense unease. The idea of purity has begun to feel less like blessing and more like obligation. In these societies, the stories told to justify sibling marriage grow heavier with explanation. What once felt natural now needs reinforcement. Priests speak more often. Ceremonies become longer. Symbolism multiplies. When belief weakens, performance increases, and you can feel that shift in the air, a subtle tightening, as though the world is holding its breath. Here, sacred blood is not merely inherited, it must be constantly proven. Royal children are paraded in public rituals to reassure the population that the divine line remains intact. Their bodies are scrutinized not only for health, but for signs. Omens read into posture, temperament, even facial expression. Any deviation sparks whispers. Any illness invites anxiety. You sense how the ruling families internalize this pressure. A child is no longer simply a child, they are evidence. Proof that the gods still approve, and when that proof feels uncertain, fear creeps in. Fear of divine abandonment, fear of rebellion, fear that the entire social order rests on something increasingly fragile. Sibling marriage, in this phase, becomes less celebratory and more defensive. It is no longer about honouring the heavens, but preventing collapse. The logic tightens. If things are going wrong, it must be because the bloodline is threatened. Therefore it must be protected even more fiercely. Closeness becomes the solution to every problem, even the ones closeness itself has created. You feel the emotional toll growing heavier. Royal siblings raised under this system are not merely destined to marry, they are taught that their union is responsibility incarnate. Their personal feelings are irrelevant beside cosmic duty. Doubt becomes dangerous. Hesitation becomes selfishness. To question tradition is to risk being blamed for famine, defeat, or unrest. In this environment, silence becomes survival. Those who feel discomfort learn to hide it. Those who feel resentment bury it beneath ceremony. The palace becomes a place where everyone performs belief, unsure who truly holds it anymore. You imagine long nights where a ruler stares at the ceiling, wondering whether the gods still listen, whether the rituals still matter, whether the bloodline truly carries meaning, and then pushing those thoughts away, because entertaining them feels like betrayal. Religion, once a source of reassurance, begins to function as enforcement. The gods are invoked not to comfort, but to compel. Disobedience is framed as sacrilege. Compliance becomes piety, and sibling marriage, bound tightly to theology, becomes nearly impossible to refuse without spiritual consequence. The people too participate in this illusion. They watch ceremonies, they chant prayers, they repeat the stories they've always known, because questioning the divine nature of rulers would destabilize not just politics, but identity. If the gods were wrong about their chosen family, what else might be wrong? So everyone plays their part. Even as doubt flickers privately, tradition marches on publicly. You feel the tragedy of that, not cruelty, but entrapment. A society so deeply invested in its own story that rewriting it feels more terrifying than continuing it. The sibling marriage persists not because it is loved, but because it is feared to be necessary. Across generations, the emotional distance between spouses grows. These are not unions of affection, they are acts of maintenance. The language used around them becomes increasingly formal. Love poems fade, legal phrasing expands. Marriage becomes administration. Children sense this coldness long before they can name it. They grow up in palaces where warmth exists, but selectively. Tutors replace parents. Ritual replaces play. Expectations hover constantly. The idea of choice feels foreign. You feel how individuality slowly erodes. When destiny is predetermined, curiosity becomes dangerous. When futures are fixed, imagination shrinks. People learn to exist within narrow emotional lanes, careful not to drift too far from expectation. And yet, humanity never disappears entirely. Small rebellions occur in private, a glance held too long, a hesitation before a vow, a moment of grief that lasts longer than protocol allows. These moments leave no mark in official history, but they shape the inner lives of those who endure them. As centuries pass, the contradictions grow harder to ignore. Empires encounter one another. Beliefs clash. Outsiders observe sibling marriage with confusion or disgust. What was once normal within becomes strange without. The realization dawns slowly. Tradition is not universal. You sense how destabilizing that discovery is. When a ruling family realizes that other societies function without sacred incest, and sometimes thrive, the old logic weakens. If power elsewhere does not depend on divine blood, then perhaps blood was never the source of power at all. But letting go of that belief would unravel everything. So instead, rulers adapt their explanations. They emphasize uniqueness. They insist their case is different. Their gods are stronger, their lineage more special, their isolation more justified. The story grows more defensive with each retelling. You feel the tension building toward transformation. The divine rationale is thinning. Soon, blood will no longer be sacred because gods demand it. It will be preserved because law demands it. Religion will slowly give way to entitlement, and sibling marriage, where it continues, will take on a colder, more calculated tone. This is the turning point, the moment when sacred tradition begins to morph into dynastic obsession. The gods fade slightly into the background. In their place rises the idea of inherited right, that power belongs to certain families not because heaven decreed it, but because history did. The justification changes, but the behaviour remains. You sense the night deepening again, preparing to carry you westward. The world ahead will no longer speak in the language of sons and divine descent. It will speak in coats of arms, noble titles, and legal succession. The closeness of blood will still matter, but now it will be defended with parchment rather than prayer. As you walk, you feel the weight of what has come before pressing behind you. Thousands of years of belief do not vanish quietly. They linger, reshaped, repurposed, rationalized. Sibling marriage will not disappear with the gods. It will simply find new excuses. The corridor ahead narrows, lined with stone instead of gold. Torches replace sunlight. And somewhere in the distance you sense Europe waiting, unaware that it is about to repeat the same mistake under a different name. You step forward, and the world tightens into stone and shadow. The open skies and divine suns fall away, replaced by thick castle walls that trap warmth and whispers alike. Here, belief no longer floats in the heavens. It is nailed into law, etched into lineage charts, guarded by seals and signatures. This is Europe awakening to power not as sacred mystery, but as inheritance. And yet, despite the change in language, the old instinct remains. Power must stay close. Blood must not wander. In these halls, sibling marriage becomes rarer in name, but not in spirit. The idea softens outward, reshaping itself into marriages between nieces and uncles, cousins and cousins, relatives close enough that the blood barely has room to breathe. What once required gods now requires documents. What was once divine is now noble. The justification changes, but the circle remains nearly closed. You feel how fear drives it. Europe is fractured, kingdoms rising and collapsing, borders shifting with every war. Dynasties cling to continuity as the only defense against chaos. If land is inherited through blood, then blood becomes territory. To marry outside the family is to risk losing power to strangers. So marriages become strategy first, family second. The royal family tree begins to bend inward, branch by branch. Each generation convinces itself it is merely preserving what already exists. They do not see themselves as starting a dangerous pattern. They believe they are maintaining order. After all, everyone around them is doing the same. You wander through halls decorated with portraits, each face solemn, eyes forward, expression restrained. These images are not meant to capture personality. They exist to prove legitimacy. Each painting whispers the same message. This line continues. This family endures. Here, childhood is brief. Noble children are taught early that their bodies are bargaining tools. Affection is allowed, but only within limits. Friendship is tolerated, but marriage is predetermined. When relatives are proposed as spouses, it is spoken of calmly, as though no other possibility ever existed. You sense the emotional quiet that settles over these households. It is not violent or dramatic, it is resigned. People accept what they are told because alternatives feel unimaginable. The world outside the family may be vast, but the world that matters exists within castle walls. As dynasties intermarry repeatedly, they become increasingly interconnected. Europe's ruling houses begin to resemble one enormous extended family, bound by treaties disguised as weddings. Cousins rule neighbouring kingdoms. Aunts become queens abroad. Uncles command armies across borders. At first, this web of kinship appears brilliant. Wars are avoided. Alliances secured. Blood ties replace swords. For a time it works. The continent stabilises not through peace, but through marriage contracts. But beneath the surface, the same problem begins to re-emerge. The closer the blood, the fewer the options. The same names recur, the same traits repeat, and with repetition comes fragility. You feel how slowly this realization dawns. There is no sudden alarm, no proclamation, just patterns noticed quietly by physicians, midwives and servants who are never asked for their opinions. Children born sickly, heirs who struggle, tempers that flare unpredictably, minds that falter under pressure. These things are not discussed openly. They are framed as divine will, unfortunate chance, or personal weakness. The idea that lineage itself might be responsible remains unthinkable. To suggest it would challenge the entire foundation of noble rule. And so, instead of widening the circle, families narrow it further. If weakness appears, the solution is not diversity, it is control. More careful selection, more internal marriages, more obsession with pedigree. You sense how tragedy and arrogance intertwine. The same families who pride themselves on refinement unknowingly amplify their vulnerabilities. They mistake sameness for strength. The Habsburgs emerge quietly here, not yet infamous, but ambitious. Through calculated marriages, they accumulate territories without war. Their motto, "Let others fight, you marry," becomes philosophy. Each union expands their reach. Each wedding brings new crowns into the family orbit. At first, it seems like genius. The family spreads across Europe like ivy, wrapping itself around thrones. Spain, Austria, the Low Countries. Influence grows through bedrooms rather than battlefields. But the cost of that success remains hidden, waiting patiently. You move through generations where cousins marry cousins with barely a pause. Genealogies grow dense, overlapping, almost unreadable. The same ancestors appear again and again, stacked atop one another like echoes. To the families involved, this repetition feels reassuring. Familiar names, trusted blood, predictability. Outsiders remain outsiders. The children raised within this system know little else. Their world is composed of relatives they barely know personally, but are intimately tied to by lineage. Their future spouses are often names on charts, long before they are faces in rooms. You imagine the strange feeling of meeting your intended partner, already knowing exactly how they fit into your family tree. Romance has no room to develop naturally. Curiosity feels irrelevant. Duty fills the space instead. And yet, Europe believes itself advanced, more rational, less mystical than ancient empires. But the same ancient fear persists beneath powdered wigs and velvet robes, fear that power, once diluted, can never be reclaimed. Religion still plays a role, but differently now. The Church blesses unions not because they are divine, but because they are sanctioned. Spiritual authority reinforces political necessity. Together, they form an unbreakable seal. As time passes, the signs grow harder to ignore. Some rulers appear visibly affected. Physical traits repeat generation after generation. Medical care improves slightly, enough to observe patterns, but not enough to explain them. Whispers spread quietly among foreign courts. Jokes are made behind closed doors, but no one challenges the system publicly. To do so would be to insult nearly every throne in Europe. You feel how isolation deepens again, not geographic this time, but social. Royal families exist within a bubble of mutual reinforcement. Everyone depends on everyone else maintaining the illusion. Because if one family admits the problem, the entire structure trembles. So they continue. Marriage follows marriage. Child follows child. The lineage presses forward, increasingly brittle beneath its gilded surface. And yet, within these rigid structures, people still feel. Some grow fond of their spouses, some despise them, some endure in quiet detachment. The human heart persists even when constrained, though it rarely directs the course of events. You sense how history, at this stage, becomes less about gods or destiny and more about momentum. The system exists because it already exists. No one knows how to stop it without losing everything. The corridor you walk now feels colder. Stone replaces warmth. Torches flicker uneasily. The belief that once glowed like sunlight now sputters like flame. Ahead, you sense a figure forming, not yet fully visible, but looming. A family whose commitment to internal marriage will become so extreme, so concentrated, that its consequences can no longer be ignored or disguised. The pattern has been set. The circle has tightened. And soon, Europe will meet the face of its own reflection, unmistakable, unavoidable, and carved into bone. You move toward that moment slowly, knowing the night has not yet reached its most unsettling hour. You move closer now, and the shape you sensed before sharpens into something unmistakable. This is the point where repetition leaves visible marks, where the inward turning of bloodlines can no longer hide behind ceremony or language. The halls feel heavier here, weighted with inheritance that has begun to show itself on human faces. This is the era where Europe's most powerful family becomes its most fragile, where lineage writes itself directly onto bone. The Habsburg dynasty stands at the centre of this moment, immense and sprawling, yet paradoxically enclosed. Their reach extends across continents, their influence shaping wars, borders, and faith itself. And yet, within their own family, the circle tightens generation by generation. Cousins marry cousins, uncles marry nieces. The same ancestors recur so often in their family trees that time itself seems to fold inward. At first, the repetition is barely noticeable. Portraits show familiar features, but that is expected. Families often resemble one another. No one panics when a child looks like his grandfather. In fact, it is celebrated. Resemblance is proof of continuity. It reassures courts and subjects alike that the rightful line remains intact. But over decades, resemblance deepens into sameness. You begin to notice it in the paintings. The same elongated face, the same heavy lower jaw, the same protruding lip. Artists do their best to soften it, to idealize it, but the structure remains. The family comes to be known for it, quietly at first, then openly. The jaw becomes a symbol, not merely of appearance, but of inheritance itself. This feature is not treated as flaw, it is reframed as distinction. A mark of noble blood, something that sets them apart from ordinary people. The family convinces itself that what others might see as deformity is instead a visible sign of legitimacy. And when belief is strong enough, even discomfort can be reinterpreted as pride. Yet the body does not respond to ideology. As generations pass, the effects accumulate. Speech becomes difficult for some, chewing painful, breathing laboured. These issues are managed privately, treated with remedies and discretion. The public image must remain composed. The ruler must appear strong, capable, chosen. But behind closed doors, concern grows. Physicians record observations cautiously. Symptoms repeat. Developmental delays appear. Fertility struggles increase. Infant mortality rises within the family even as it declines among the general population. No one connects the dots openly. To do so would mean admitting that the dynasty's greatest strategy, keeping power close, may be destroying it from within. So the response is not change, but doubling down. Marriage negotiations become even more insular. Trusted blood becomes more valuable than ever. Outsiders are considered unpredictable. If weakness has emerged, the solution must be stricter control, not expansion. The logic circles endlessly, feeding itself. You feel how trapped everyone becomes inside this reasoning. There is no villain here, no single decision-maker choosing disaster. Instead, there is momentum. Precedent. Fear. Each generation inherits not only power, but the burden of preserving what they did not create and cannot easily escape. Children are born into this system without choice. From infancy, they are symbols. Their bodies represent the future of empires. When a child struggles, it is not just a family concern, it is a political emergency. You imagine the pressure on these young heirs. Every cough monitored, every difficulty whispered about, every flaw magnified by its implications. They are loved, yes, but also scrutinized relentlessly. As time moves forward, the dynasty produces one ruler who embodies all these tensions more than any before him. A king whose very body becomes a record of centuries of internal marriage. He is born into unimaginable privilege and unimaginable fragility. His name is Charles, and from the beginning his life is defined by limitation. He struggles to speak clearly, he has difficulty chewing, his health is poor. His mind, though earnest, does not develop with the ease expected of a ruler, and yet, through inheritance alone, he becomes king of Spain and ruler of an empire stretching across oceans. You feel the tragedy in this not as spectacle, but as inevitability. Charles did not choose his lineage, he did not design the system that shaped him. He is its product, assembled slowly across generations. The court surrounds him with caretakers, advisors, protectors. Decisions are made on his behalf. Power continues to function, but no longer through the monarch himself. Authority becomes ceremonial, while governance slips into the hands of others. And still, the illusion must be maintained. The king appears in public. Portraits are commissioned. His image is controlled carefully. Painters exaggerate strength, adjust proportions, soften features. Art works overtime to compensate for reality. The people sense something is wrong, even if they cannot articulate it. Rumours circulate. Whispers follow processions. The empire continues, but confidence erodes. This is the moment where the cost of dynastic obsession becomes undeniable, not in theory, but in flesh. You stand with this realization for a while. How a strategy that once conquered half of Europe now threatens to undo it. How the refusal to adapt becomes more dangerous than any external enemy. And yet, even now, change does not come easily. The system persists almost out of habit. There is no blueprint for doing things differently. The dynasty has become too large, too entrenched, too intertwined with the identity of nations themselves. Charles lives his life under constant supervision, his reign defined more by survival than leadership. When he dies without heirs, the line ends abruptly. Centuries of careful preservation collapse into silence. The extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line is not dramatic. There is no final battle, no great catastrophe. It simply stops. The blood that was guarded so fiercely fails to continue. And with that end comes a reckoning. Europe watches closely. The consequences ripple outward. Wars erupt over succession. Borders are redrawn. The death of one fragile king reshapes the continent. For the first time, the link between excessive intermarriage and decline becomes impossible to ignore. Physicians, scholars and observers begin to speak more openly. Patterns are acknowledged. The conversation shifts slowly from morality to biology. It is not compassion that prompts this change, it is practicality. Rulers begin to understand that preserving power requires adaptability, not enclosure. That sameness, taken too far, weakens rather than strengthens. You feel the mood shift subtly as you move forward. The belief in pure blood begins to crack. Not entirely, pride dies slowly, but enough to allow alternatives to be considered. Some families loosen restrictions. Others do so quietly, disguising change as strategy rather than reform. Marriages still serve politics, but the circle widens just enough to breathe. The Habsburg story becomes a caution whispered behind palace doors, not openly condemned, but privately acknowledged. A reminder of what happens when tradition becomes more important than reality. And yet, even as science inches closer to explanation, the emotional legacy remains. The idea that families must preserve themselves through control lingers. The instinct does not vanish, it merely adapts. You take a slow breath here, feeling the weight of centuries lift slightly. The night feels deeper now, but calmer too. The worst has been witnessed. The cost made visible. Ahead, the story will shift again, toward awareness, resistance, and quiet rebellion. Toward those who began to question what they inherited. Toward the moment when individuals, not dynasties, slowly reclaim the right to choose. But for now, you stand beside a lineage that tried to outlast time by folding inward, and in doing so, discovered that survival requires movement, not stasis. The torchlight flickers softly as you step onward, leaving behind a dynasty carved into history not only by its power, but by the lesson written into its bones. You move forward again, and something subtly changes in the air. The weight of inevitability that once pressed so hard against your chest begins to loosen, just slightly. The palaces are still grand, the bloodline still guarded, but now you sense cracks. Not structural ones yet, but emotional ones. This is the era where royal marriages begin to look tender on the surface, even affectionate, while remaining fundamentally unfree beneath. Love letters appear. Portraits soften. Public narratives shift, but the walls, though decorated differently, remain firmly in place. Here, sibling marriages have mostly faded in name, yet their legacy lingers in spirit. The bloodlines are still tight. Cousins still marry cousins. Relatives still circle one another in carefully arranged unions. But something new emerges alongside duty. The idea that affection might coexist with obligation. Courts begin to tell themselves that if a marriage appears loving, then its origins matter less. You walk through rooms where letters are exchanged quietly, where spouses address one another with warmth in ink even when their union was arranged before birth. Historians later will read these letters and wonder whether love truly existed, or whether tenderness was simply another performance learned early. You feel how complicated this moment is. These couples are not rebels, not revolutionaries. They do not reject tradition outright. Instead, they attempt to humanize it. They cling to closeness not only through blood, but through emotional intimacy, as if affection might redeem the structure itself. Some marriages do soften into companionship. Shared routines, shared losses, shared endurance. When two people are raised within the same system, sometimes they learn to survive it together. In a strange way, familiarity becomes comfort, not freedom, but shelter. Yet that shelter is fragile, because even the most caring relationship cannot erase the absence of choice. The knowledge that love, however real it becomes, was never allowed to begin freely. That awareness lingers quietly, shaping expectations, limiting imagination. You sense how royal households at this stage become emotionally restrained but not cold. There is laughter now, sometimes genuine. Music fills halls, children play, life continues. But beneath it all remains a quiet understanding. Everything personal is still political. A marriage may appear affectionate, but it is still evaluated for usefulness. A pregnancy celebrated not only for joy, but for what it secures. A child loved deeply, yet immediately categorized within succession plans. You imagine the peculiar tension of such love, sincere, yet supervised, intimate, yet never fully private. Even moments of tenderness occur beneath invisible eyes. As generations move on, the old extremes soften. The most dangerous levels of inbreeding decline. Families widen their reach slightly. The lesson of the Habsburgs lingers like a ghost no one names aloud. Physicians are consulted more seriously. Health becomes a quiet consideration in marriage negotiations. Still, no one speaks openly of genetics. The language remains euphemistic. They speak of balance, of strong constitutions, of favourable matches. Science hovers at the edge of understanding, not yet fully formed, but close enough to unsettle tradition. You feel the world shifting beneath the palaces. The Enlightenment approaches. Ideas begin to circulate that challenge inherited authority itself. Philosophers question divine right. Writers ask why power should belong to families at all. These ideas frighten royalty more than any illness ever could. In response, many courts retreat emotionally even as they modernize outwardly. They sponsor art, science, architecture, proof of progress, while clinging tightly to marriage customs behind closed doors. The image of advancement becomes a shield. And yet, something has already changed. For the first time, rulers begin to experience internal conflict. Not merely fear of rebellion, but doubt. They wonder, privately, whether tradition truly serves them, or whether they serve it. You sense that doubt in small decisions. A marriage delayed. A distant cousin chosen instead of a closer one. A negotiation that considers temperament alongside title. These are tiny shifts, barely noticeable at first, but meaningful. Individuals begin to matter slightly more than lineage charts. Still, the old habits die slowly. When political pressure rises, families revert instantly to familiarity. In times of war or instability, blood closeness feels safer again. Fear has a way of resurrecting tradition. You notice how history rarely moves in straight lines. Progress advances, retreats, hesitates. The human desire for certainty constantly pulls against the impulse to change. Within royal marriages, this conflict plays out quietly. Some spouses grow close through shared confinement. Others grow distant, resentful, detached. Both responses are understandable. Both are products of the same system. Children raised in these households inherit not only titles, but emotional ambiguity. They are taught etiquette, restraint, and loyalty, but rarely taught how to choose. Desire becomes something to manage, not explore. You imagine young princes and princesses watching their parents interact, polite, measured, occasionally warm, often distant. They learn that love, if it exists, must fit inside rules. And yet, cracks widen. The outside world grows louder. Merchants gain power. Nations rise not through blood but through industry. Armies answer to states, not families. The logic of inherited supremacy weakens. Royal blood no longer feels magical. It begins to feel symbolic, important, yes, but not sacred. This shift changes marriage forever. Where once sibling unions were framed as cosmic necessity, now even cousin marriages require justification. Public opinion, though still limited, begins to matter. Newspapers circulate gossip. Satirists mock excess. The idea of monarchy itself comes under scrutiny. You feel the unease spreading through palaces. Rulers sense the ground moving beneath them. The solution, again, is control, but control now takes subtler forms. Marriages are still arranged, but language changes. Compatibility is mentioned. Education valued. Appearance is emphasized. The story told to the public becomes softer, more relatable. Behind the scenes, however, the same calculations continue. You linger with a sense of quiet melancholy here. This is not the dramatic collapse of empires or the shocking deformities of earlier centuries. This is something gentler and sadder, people trying to make an unfree system feel humane. Some succeed in small ways. They find affection. They build families that function. They carve meaning where they can. Others feel the walls closing in and retreat inward, emotionally numb. History does not record which outcome was more common. It preserves outcomes, not feelings. But you can sense them, the private frustrations, the silent griefs, the moments of longing for a life never permitted. As the night deepens, you realise that sibling marriage as an overt practice is largely gone now. Its shadow, however, stretches long. The instinct to preserve power through family remains embedded in royal psychology. It will take revolutions, wars, and scientific understanding to finally dismantle it, and even then, echoes will persist. You walk onward through quieter halls now. Fewer torches, fewer ceremonies. The story is transitioning from inevitability toward resistance. Ahead, you sense figures who will begin to refuse, not loudly, not heroically, but privately. Queens who delay weddings, princes who resist expectations, families who choose differently, even at cost. The night is far from over, but the tone has changed. The story no longer feels trapped in repetition. It feels uncertain, and uncertainty, for the first time, holds possibility. You continue forward, listening to your own breathing, steady and slow, as history prepares to loosen its grip just a little more. You move onward, and the halls begin to feel less ceremonial and more domestic, quieter in a way that suggests decisions are being made behind closed doors rather than proclaimed from balconies. The crowns are still polished, the titles still inherited, but something fundamental has shifted. The age of unquestioned tradition is slipping away, replaced by negotiation, hesitation, and compromise. This is the period where the consequences of centuries of closed bloodlines are no longer whispered only among physicians and servants, but acknowledged within ruling families themselves, carefully, reluctantly, and often in private. Here, the weight of inheritance presses hardest on those least able to bear it. Sickly heirs, fragile children, rulers exhausted before their time. These realities force uncomfortable conversations. Not public ones, not revolutionary ones, but murmured exchanges late at night between advisors and monarchs who sense that something must change, even if they don't yet know how. You feel the anxiety threading through these households. Dynasties that once believed themselves eternal now confront vulnerability. When an heir fails to thrive, it is no longer dismissed easily as fate. Patterns have become too visible. loss repeats too predictably. Grief no longer feels random, and so, for the first time, bloodlines are discussed not as sacred mysteries but as risks. This is not compassion driving reform, it is survival. Royal physicians begin comparing notes. Scholars collect records. Family trees are studied with new attention. They do not yet speak of genes, but they notice accumulation. Repetition. Weakness compounding itself across generations. You sense the unease this creates. To acknowledge these patterns is to admit that tradition may be flawed, and if tradition is flawed, then the authority built upon it trembles. So the response is cautious. No proclamations, no sudden breaks. Instead, slow adjustments. Marriages arranged with slightly more distance between relatives. Alliances widened just enough to introduce unfamiliar blood, while still preserving status. These choices are framed as strategy, not reform, as diplomacy, not doubt. The language matters, because admitting fear would invite scrutiny, yet the fear is there, pulsing beneath every negotiation. You walk through chambers where lineage charts are redrawn, branches extending outward for the first time in generations. Each extension feels risky. Outsiders bring unpredictability, new ideas, new loyalties, new influences, but they also bring vitality, and rulers begin to understand, reluctantly, that vitality is necessary. The emotional cost of this transition is complex. For some, it feels like relief. For others, betrayal. Elders resist change fiercely, clinging to the systems that defined their lives. Younger generations feel caught between respect and instinct. You imagine a young royal being told that their marriage will not follow the old patterns, and feeling both freedom and fear. Freedom from confinement. Fear of disappointing ancestors whose portraits line every wall. The ghosts of the past are everywhere here. Each corridor displays faces that lived and died under stricter rules. To break from tradition feels like turning one's back on them. And yet, the living must survive. As Enlightenment ideas spread further, the concept of personal agency gains strength. The notion that individuals might have preferences, inclinations, even rights, begins to infiltrate aristocratic thinking. Slowly, unevenly, often hypocritically, royal families adopt the language of modernity while struggling to embody it. You sense the contradiction in their lives. Publicly, they champion progress. Privately, they wrestle with fear of losing relevance. Power is no longer guaranteed by blood alone. It must now be justified to increasingly literate vocal populations. Marriage becomes part of that justification. Unions are staged not only for alliance, but for optics. The appearance of harmony matters. The image of a healthy family becomes political currency. And so, while sibling marriage is long gone, its legacy persists in the expectation that marriage must serve the institution first and the individual second. You feel how difficult it is for rulers to navigate this in-between era. Too much tradition invites decline. Too much change invites revolution. Every decision feels dangerous. Some monarchs attempt genuine reform. They marry for affection, or at least mutual respect. They raise children with warmth rather than rigid formality. These efforts are modest, often constrained, but meaningful. Others resist entirely, retreating into ceremony, insisting that the old ways still work. Their courts grow increasingly isolated, increasingly anachronistic. History judges them unevenly. You notice how science continues inching closer to explanation. Medical texts grow more detailed. Anatomy is studied. Inheritance becomes a topic of curiosity rather than taboo. Still, the language remains careful. No one wants to accuse royalty of biological weakness. But understanding advances regardless of comfort. The realization dawns that diversity strengthens, repetition weakens, that health thrives on variation, that families, like ecosystems, require openness to endure. This realization does not spread evenly. Some regions adapt faster than others. Some dynasties learn from past mistakes. Others repeat them until consequences force intervention. You sense how exhaustion permeates the old noble houses. The pressure to produce heirs, maintain dignity, satisfy public expectation, all while navigating an unstable world, takes its toll. Many rulers grow weary of being symbols. They long, quietly, to be human. That longing manifests in subtle rebellion. A delayed wedding, a refusal to remarry quickly after loss. A preference voiced, gently but firmly. These acts seem small, but within rigid systems, they are seismic. Courts gossip. Advisors warn. But sometimes the ruler persists, and with each act of quiet resistance, the system loosens slightly. You feel the emotional shift this creates in royal families. Conversations become more open. Expectations, though still heavy, become negotiable. The idea that tradition can bend without breaking begins to take hold. This does not erase the past. The damage done across centuries cannot be undone. But it can be acknowledged. And acknowledgement is powerful. You linger here in this transitional twilight, where old beliefs have not yet vanished but no longer dominate unquestioned, where the certainty that once justified sibling marriage has dissolved into cautionary memory. The lesson has been learned. Even if not spoken aloud, power cannot be preserved by closing inward forever. As the night stretches on, you sense history exhaling. The grip of inevitability loosens. The story no longer marches blindly forward. It hesitates, reflects, chooses. Ahead, the narrative will turn toward those who openly resisted, who broke with expectation, who paid prices for choosing differently. Toward the slow emergence of modern monarchy, ceremonial rather than absolute, symbolic rather than divine. But for now, you remain in this delicate middle space, where fear and hope coexist, and where families begin, at last, to understand that survival may depend not on preserving blood, but on allowing it to breathe. You take a slow breath and continue onward, the echoes behind you softening as the corridor opens into something less rigid, less predetermined, and perhaps for the first time, truly alive. You move forward, and the world feels less rigid now, as though the stone itself has begun to soften. The corridors are still lined with portraits, but the faces seem less identical, the lineage less tightly wound. This is the point where history begins to look back on itself. The past is no longer a guide to follow blindly, but a caution hovering quietly in memory. Royal families have not abandoned tradition entirely, but they no longer trust it without question. Something has shifted inside the collective understanding of power. Here, appearances matter more than ever, because uncertainty has entered the room. Monarchs are still born, still crowned, still surrounded by ceremony, but belief no longer feels absolute. The idea that blood alone grants authority has weakened. Now it must be reinforced through image, narrative, and public reassurance. Portraits are commissioned not simply to record lineage, but to persuade. Strength is emphasized. Normality highlighted. Anything that hints at fragility is quietly erased. You feel how much effort this requires. The old world relied on faith. This one relies on management. In this era, royal households become increasingly conscious of how they are perceived. Rumours spread faster. Printing presses carry gossip beyond palace walls. The private lives of rulers are no longer sealed away from public imagination. What was once hidden by reverence is now exposed to curiosity. And curiosity is dangerous. The memory of dynastic collapse lingers, especially the lesson carved into the bones of earlier families. Everyone knows what happens when blood circles too tightly. No one wants to repeat it, but no one wants to say it aloud either. So silence becomes strategy. Marriages are announced with optimism. Births celebrated extravagantly. Health is emphasized in public proclamations. Courts speak constantly of vigour, prosperity, continuity. The language of assurance fills the gap left by lost certainty. Behind the scenes, however, fear remains. You sense it in the careful selection of spouses. Genealogies are scrutinized more deeply than ever. Distance between families becomes a virtue rather than a threat. Foreign blood, once feared, is now cautiously welcomed, though always framed as alliance, never necessity. This marks a profound psychological shift. For centuries, closeness meant safety. Now, closeness carries risk, yet habits die slowly. Many royal families still feel instinctively drawn toward familiarity. Trust is easier when shared ancestry exists. So they compromise, marrying relatives once removed, distant cousins rather than close ones. The circle widens, but only cautiously, like a hand opening one finger at a time. You feel the tension of this compromise. It satisfies neither tradition nor progress fully. It is survival by hesitation. Children born into this world inherit contradictions. They are told they matter as individuals, yet their futures remain negotiated long before adulthood. They are encouraged to be educated, thoughtful, cultured, but not autonomous. Choice is discussed, but rarely granted freely. And yet, something subtle emerges. Awareness. Young royals begin to ask questions their ancestors never could. Why must marriages serve politics? Why should birth dictate destiny? These questions are not shouted. They are whispered in studies, scribbled in journals, shared between siblings late at night. Not all act on these thoughts. Many cannot. But the questions themselves represent change. You sense how monarchy is beginning to transform from inevitability into institution, something constructed, maintained, justified, and anything constructed can in theory be altered. This realization unsettles older generations deeply. They have lived their entire lives inside inherited certainty. To imagine alternatives feels like erasure of meaning. If power is not divinely ordained, what was their suffering for? What were their sacrifices preserving? So resistance emerges alongside reform. Some courts cling desperately to tradition, insisting that change invites chaos. Others adapt more openly, redefining monarchy as service rather than supremacy. These differences create fractures between royal houses, even as they remain outwardly polite. You walk through these tensions, feeling how history holds its breath. The world is changing faster now. Revolutions stir. Ideas spread beyond control. The notion of equality begins to unsettle the very foundation of inherited privilege. Marriage, once the cornerstone of dynastic power, begins to lose its political weight. Alliances matter less when armies belong to nations rather than families. Borders harden. States replace bloodlines as units of authority. This shift is slow but irreversible. Royal marriages still occur, still fascinate the public, still generate headlines, but they no longer determine the fate of continents. They become symbolic rather than structural. And when symbolism replaces necessity, choice begins to creep in. You feel the emotional release this allows, even if limited. For the first time in centuries, it becomes possible, though not easy, for a royal to resist a proposed match without collapsing an empire. Consequences remain, but they are personal rather than existential. Some choose love and pay with status. Others choose duty and carry quiet regret. Both paths exist now, imperfectly. The memory of sibling marriage remains like a distant shadow, invoked occasionally as an example of what must never return. It becomes a story told cautiously, stripped of justification and framed as excess. A warning rather than a model. History begins to moralize what it once normalized. You feel the weight of that transformation. The same act that was once sacred is now unthinkable. Not because humans suddenly changed, but because understanding deepened. Science advances further. The mechanisms of inheritance become clearer. Patterns once attributed to fate are now recognized as consequence. Language shifts. Words like risk and probability enter discussions once dominated by destiny. This knowledge spreads unevenly, but it spreads, and with it comes accountability. Royal families can no longer pretend ignorance. Choices carry responsibility now, not divine cover. If harm results, it cannot be blamed on gods alone. This realization reshapes morality itself. The line between privilege and obligation becomes sharper. To rule is no longer merely to inherit, it is to justify one's existence continuously. You sense the emotional fatigue this produces. Many royals feel trapped between worlds, too privileged to live freely, too exposed to remain untouched. The glamour persists, but certainty does not. The past presses behind them, the future looms ahead. In this space, sibling marriage finally becomes something distant, almost unreal, a relic of another way of thinking. Its logic no longer fits the world taking shape, and yet its psychological imprint remains: the fear of dilution, the obsession with lineage, the instinct to protect power by keeping it close. These instincts do not vanish with reason. They linger in habits, anxieties, unspoken preferences. History does not erase itself cleanly, it leaves residue. You walk through this residue now, feeling how the old world dissolves slowly rather than shattering. The transformation is quieter than collapse, but no less profound. Palaces remain, but their meaning changes. Thrones still exist, but they are no longer unquestioned. Families persist, but they must adapt or fade. And beneath it all, humanity finally begins to reassert itself, imperfectly, unevenly, but persistently. The night feels calmer here, not peaceful exactly, but steadier. The fear that once drove blood inward has softened. The belief that survival requires enclosure has been challenged and found wanting. You sense that the story is nearing its final movements now. Not an ending, but a settling. The echoes of twisted marriages grow fainter, replaced by reflection rather than repetition. Ahead lies the modern world, shaped by these mistakes, warned by them, still imperfect but no longer blind. You continue walking, your steps unhurried, as history exhales around you, releasing centuries of tension into the quiet dark. You move onward, and something quiet but resolute enters the story. The corridors are still lined with tradition, still echo with expectation, but now there are pauses, moments where history does not advance automatically. This is where refusal appears, not as rebellion shouted from balconies, but as stillness, as hesitation, as a single person choosing not to step forward when everyone expects them to. The power of this section does not come from armies or revolutions, but from restraint. These are the queens and royal women who did not fully submit to the roles prepared for them. Not all were openly defiant. Many never spoke against the system at all, but they delayed. They resisted quietly. They negotiated. They endured pressure without yielding completely. In worlds built on obedience, even hesitation becomes radical. You feel the tension surrounding them immediately. Royal daughters were raised with destiny pressing down from infancy. Marriage was not a question of if, but when and to whom. Their bodies were considered assets, their futures pre-written. A refusal threatened alliances, offended courts, destabilized plans, laid years in advance. Yet some women resisted anyway, not always from ideology, often from instinct. A sense that something about the arrangement felt wrong. A desire for autonomy they may not have had language for, but felt deeply nonetheless. You imagine the silence after such resistance, the stunned advisors, the anxious relatives, the conversations held behind closed doors. Everyone searching for a way to reframe the refusal without admitting it exists. Sometimes illness is invoked, sometimes grief, sometimes prolonged mourning becomes a shield. These women learn quickly that survival lies not in confrontation, but in timing. Delay long enough, and political urgency shifts. Circumstances change. A proposed match loses relevance. A war begins. A ruler dies. The moment passes. Delay becomes power. You sense how deliberate this strategy is. A queen who cannot say no outright learns to say not yet, and in doing so, she claims something rare: control over time. In earlier centuries, such resistance would have been unthinkable. But now, as monarchy evolves and divine authority weakens, space opens, narrow, precarious, but real. Some queens remain unmarried entirely, ruling alone or serving as regents. Their unmarried status becomes a political tool rather than a liability. They are portrayed as married to their nation, their duty elevated above domestic expectation. This reframing is crucial. It allows refusal without shame. The absence of a husband is no longer failure, but sacrifice. You feel how carefully these narratives are constructed. Everything must appear intentional. Nothing can look like defiance. The illusion of harmony must remain intact. Yet, beneath the language, something profound is happening. For the first time in centuries, a royal woman's worth is not defined solely by whom she marries or what she produces. Authority begins, cautiously, to detach from reproduction. This is revolutionary, even if no one calls it that. Some women resist not marriage itself, but specific unions. They reject close kin matches quietly, pressing instead for alliances farther afield. In doing so, they widen bloodlines and alter dynastic futures, often without public acknowledgement. Others marry but refuse intimacy, maintaining unions in name only. This choice is fraught with danger. It invites scrutiny. Rumours spread. Pressure intensifies, yet some persist, negotiating their personal boundaries within institutions never designed to respect them. You feel the courage this requires, not the dramatic courage of battlefield defiance, but the exhausting courage of daily resistance, of standing firm against expectation, while surrounded by people invested in your compliance. These women are not always celebrated. Some are labelled cold. Difficult. Unwomanly. History often frames them as anomalies rather than agents of change, but their impact is undeniable. Each refusal weakens the assumption that marriage is inevitable. Each delay exposes the system's reliance on compliance. Each act of personal sovereignty chips away at centuries of inherited logic. You sense how these choices ripple outward. Younger royals observe them. Advisors recalibrate expectations. Possibility expands, however slightly. The palace atmosphere changes. Marriage negotiations become less absolute. The idea of consent, though still constrained, begins to matter. This does not mean freedom is achieved. Many of these women pay heavy prices. Isolation, loneliness, constant scrutiny. Their choices are rarely celebrated in their lifetimes, yet they persist. You imagine a queen lying awake at night, fully aware of the cost of her decision, yet unwilling to surrender her autonomy. Her power does not come from armies or lineage, but from endurance, from the refusal to vanish into a role she did not choose. In some cases, their resistance intersects with political necessity. A realm benefits from a ruler unentangled in foreign marriages. Independence becomes strategy. Personal choice aligns with national interest, and suddenly, what once seemed dangerous becomes acceptable. This alignment is rare, but powerful. It reveals something crucial. Systems can change when self-interest aligns with humanity. You feel how these moments mark a turning point. The logic that once demanded closeness of blood begins to lose its grip. The fear of dilution weakens. The belief that women exist primarily to secure lineage erodes. Slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. These queens do not dismantle monarchy. They reshape it from within. Their stories are often quieter in records, overshadowed by wars, treaties, and male succession. But their influence persists in the space they carved, the pause they introduced into an otherwise relentless pattern. History begins to accommodate the idea that not every ruler must reproduce to legitimize their reign. That authority can exist without biological continuation. That power can be exercised without marriage. This idea would have been inconceivable in the age of sibling unions. You pause with that realization. How far the story has travelled. From divine bloodlines marrying themselves to queens choosing solitude over submission. The contrast is stark, and yet both emerge from the same source: fear of loss. Earlier rulers feared losing divine favour. These women fear losing themselves. Both fears are understandable, but the responses differ profoundly. As time moves forward, these acts of refusal accumulate. They do not form a movement, but a pattern, a quiet one, a human one. You sense how the world slowly adjusts around them. The shock fades, the exception becomes precedent, the unthinkable becomes merely unusual. And once something is merely unusual, it can become accepted. The memory of twisted marriages recedes further now, no longer haunting the present directly. Instead, it lingers as caution, a reminder of what happens when systems deny individual humanity. These queens, in their restraint, offer a different model, one not of purity or preservation, but of dignity. You feel the tone of the night soften again. The story is no longer about confinement alone. It is about release, partial, imperfect, but real. Ahead, the narrative will turn outward, toward the modern world, where the consequences of ancient choices still echo in families far removed from thrones, where genetics, psychology, and memory intertwine. But here, in this quiet chapter, you linger with those who said no without shouting, who reshaped history not by force, but by standing still. Their refusal did not end monarchy, but it helped end inevitability, and that, you realise, may be the most powerful change of all. You continue forward gently, carrying with you the stillness they left behind, a silence not of obedience, but of choice. You move forward and the world feels quieter than before, not because nothing is happening, but because collapse rarely announces itself. There are no trumpets here, no dramatic endings carved cleanly into time. Instead, dynasties begin to thin the way old fabric does, slowly, almost politely, until one day it simply cannot hold together anymore. This is where power does not fall, it fades. The great families that once believed themselves eternal now struggle with continuity. Their names still command respect, their palaces still stand, but the certainty that once animated them has drained away. Succession becomes complicated, heirs are fewer, marriages feel delayed, negotiated, uncertain. Where once lineage surged forward confidently, now it hesitates. You sense how exhaustion settles into these households. Generations spent maintaining appearances, managing perception, protecting bloodlines, all of it has taken a toll. The younger members inherit not confidence, but burden. They are expected to uphold traditions whose purpose even their elders can no longer fully explain. The old fear that power will be lost if blood spreads too far competes with a newer fear that power will vanish if blood cannot continue at all. This tension defines the era. Some dynasties simply run out of heirs, others fracture into competing branches, each claiming legitimacy. In the absence of clear succession, disputes multiply. Authority weakens not through rebellion, but through ambiguity. You feel how unsettling this is for societies built on certainty. When people no longer know who should rule, faith erodes. Loyalty becomes conditional. Respect becomes nostalgic rather than instinctive. Monarchies begin to resemble relics, impressive, symbolic, but increasingly disconnected from daily life. This is not the result of a single decision or reform. It is the accumulation of centuries of inward focus finally reaching its limit. The same logic that once concentrated power now leaves too little room for renewal. You imagine vast family trees with many names crossed out, lines that end abruptly. branches that never grow. And with each ending, a quiet reckoning occurs. Not one of blame, but of realization. The belief that blood alone could sustain authority has proven false. No matter how carefully preserved, lineage cannot compensate for changing worlds. Empires expand, economies shift, knowledge grows. The systems that once justified dynastic rule lose relevance. Royal families feel this keenly. They are still visible, still privileged, but no longer essential. And so their collapse, when it comes, is rarely violent. It is administrative. Ceremonial, legal. Crowns are relinquished, titles redefined, powers transferred to parliaments, councils, constitutions. You sense the melancholy of this transition. For centuries, these families believed themselves responsible for the world's order. To step aside feels like failure, even when it is necessary. Some resist. Others accept quietly, many do both at once. The great irony settles gently over you. Dynasties that once clung to internal marriage to preserve power end not with conquest, but with consent. They are not overthrown, they are outgrown. The public too changes. People begin to see rulers not as sacred figures, but as inherited administrators. Their flaws are visible now, not hidden behind divine myth. The memory of twisted marriages resurfaces occasionally in conversation, history books, and moral reflection. It becomes an example of excess, of what happens when tradition overrides humanity. But it is discussed without outrage, more with distance. As something strange, archaic, incomprehensible, that distance itself marks progress. You feel how collective memory reshapes the past. What was once revered becomes cautionary. What was once normalized becomes unthinkable. And yet, the emotional residue remains within families themselves. Former royal households struggle with identity. Without absolute power, who are they? Their lineage still exists, but its meaning has changed. The blood that once defined destiny now defines heritage only. Some adapt gracefully, finding purpose in philanthropy, culture, or quiet influence. Others cling desperately to symbols, titles, ceremonies, old grievances, unable to accept the loss of supremacy. You feel the sadness in that struggle. To be raised believing you are essential, then to discover you are optional, is deeply disorienting. For many, the collapse of dynastic authority is not liberation, it is grief. And yet, beyond palace walls, life continues. The world adjusts. Systems once tied to families realign around institutions. Law replaces lineage. Citizenship replaces birthright. The change is imperfect, uneven, often unjust in new ways, but it moves forward. The long shadow of incestuous royal marriage fades further into history, no longer influencing policy, no longer shaping succession. Its consequences remain in records, portraits, and medical histories, but not in practice. The cycle is broken. You sense how profound that is. A pattern spanning thousands of years across continents and cultures finally ends not through condemnation, but through irrelevance. It simply stops making sense, and perhaps that is the most human ending imaginable. People do not always abandon harmful systems because they recognize their harm. Often they abandon them because the world changes until the system can no longer function. The old logic collapses under the weight of modern complexity. As you walk through this phase, the air feels calmer, but heavier with memory. The story is no longer about dramatic acts, but about aftermath, about what lingers when certainty dissolves. Families look backward and forward simultaneously. They preserve history while learning to live without its authority. You sense how identity itself becomes fluid. Being born into a famous name no longer dictates your life entirely. It shapes it, but does not trap it. That freedom arrives quietly, unevenly, and not without pain. The palaces remain, but many are now museums. Rooms once filled with whispers of succession now echo with footsteps of visitors. Portraits stare out not as rulers, but as artifacts. The faces that once commanded obedience now invite curiosity, and curiosity, unlike fear, does not demand submission. You pause here, surrounded by that quiet transformation. The long night of inherited inevitability has softened into dawn like stillness. The twisted marriages that once defined power now exist only as lessons, reminders of what happens when systems prioritize preservation over people. As you continue forward, you feel that the story is nearing its final descent, not into darkness, but into understanding. The past no longer grips the present, it informs it. And that distinction changes everything. You walk on, the echoes behind you fading into history, carrying forward not judgment, but awareness. The gentle knowledge that survival depends not on closing inward, but on learning when to let go. You move forward, and the world feels unmistakably closer to your own now. The distance that once separated ancient thrones from modern lives has thinned. The palaces are quieter, many emptied of authority, yet the echoes of old decisions still hum beneath the surface. This is where history stops feeling remote and begins to feel personal. The story no longer belongs only to kings and queens. It begins to touch ordinary families, modern science, and the subtle ways the past continues to shape the present. The collapse of dynastic power did not erase its biological legacy. Bloodlines do not vanish when crowns are set aside. They continue forward, diluted, dispersed, absorbed into broader populations. The effects of centuries of closed marriage patterns linger quietly, sometimes surfacing generations later in ways no one expects. You sense how strange this realization is, that choices made long before electricity or microscopes could ripple forward into a world of hospitals, universities, and genetic testing. History, it turns out, does not remain politely in the past. As science advances, the language finally catches up with observation. What physicians once noticed but could not explain becomes clearer. Inheritance is no longer mysterious. Traits, vulnerabilities, and predispositions can be traced, mapped, understood. This knowledge reframes the past completely. What was once interpreted as divine will or personal failing becomes recognized as consequence, not punishment, not curse. Simply biology responding to repetition. And with that understanding comes something new: compassion. Modern scholars no longer look at fragile rulers with mockery or judgment. They see them as products of systems that denied choice, as individuals shaped by expectations that left no room for refusal. Their suffering becomes contextual rather than sensational. You feel how this shift matters. It transforms history from spectacle into lesson. Families once whispered about become case studies, not to shame, but to learn. The goal is no longer to preserve lineage, but to understand how diversity protects life. The old obsession with purity fades into something almost incomprehensible. The idea that blood could be clean or tainted feels archaic now, a misunderstanding born of fear rather than fact. Yet traces of that thinking persist. You notice it in language people still use, in the quiet emphasis on good families, in the way inheritance and legacy remain emotionally charged concepts. Even stripped of monarchy, the instinct to value lineage over individuality lingers in subtle forms. History does not vanish. It adapts. But now, knowledge stands where belief once ruled. The modern world begins to confront the past not with condemnation, but with clarity. Museums explain context. Historians trace patterns. Geneticists confirm what intuition long suspected. The story of sibling marriage shifts fully from taboo curiosity into cautionary example, a demonstration of how power distorts decision-making when fear overrides empathy. You feel the emotional tone change here. The night grows calmer, reflective. no longer haunted by inevitability, but softened by understanding. The people of the past are no longer judged by modern morality alone. They are seen within the constraints they inhabited. Their choices are understood as shaped by survival logic, flawed but human. This does not excuse the harm, it explains it. An explanation allows healing. You sense how this knowledge influences modern ethics. Laws are shaped by understanding rather than superstition. Safeguards exist not because something feels wrong, but because evidence demonstrates risk. The boundary between taboo and reason becomes clear, and that clarity extends beyond royalty. Across cultures, communities reflect on traditions once justified by fear, honour, or preservation. Some are discarded, others re-examined. The world becomes more willing to ask why something exists, not just whether it always has. This questioning is the true legacy of the end of dynastic enclosure. You feel gratitude here, quietly. Gratitude that knowledge arrived before repetition could continue unchecked. Gratitude that understanding replaced myth. And yet, the story does not conclude neatly. Because humans are not purely rational creatures. Even with science, people still long for belonging, continuity, connection to ancestry. Heritage remains meaningful, family remains central. The difference now is that connection is no longer enforced through restriction. Choice enters the equation. You sense how profound that is. Choice changes everything. To choose one's partner freely is to break the ancient cycle completely. It introduces unpredictability, but also vitality. It allows love, compatibility, and mutual respect to shape families rather than obligation. The past fades further with each generation born into freedom. Still, echoes remain in culture, literature, fascination. People remain drawn to stories of royal excess, twisted lineages, and forbidden unions. Not because they wish to repeat them, but because they want to understand how such systems existed at all. Curiosity replaces fear, and curiosity is safer. You walk through this modern landscape of reflection and learning. Universities debate, documentaries analyse, families research ancestry with interest rather than anxiety. The past becomes something to study, not obey. You realise that this may be the most meaningful transformation of all, not the fall of monarchies, not the end of incestuous marriages, but the shift from inevitability to inquiry. Humans begin to see that tradition is not sacred simply because it is old. It must earn its place through benefit, not endurance. This awareness spreads quietly, influencing everything from governance to parenting to personal relationships. The idea that suffering is necessary for continuity loses credibility. Life becomes something to protect, not sacrifice. You sense how gentle this part of the story is. There is no villain to confront, no dramatic finale, only a slow collective exhale as humanity recognises a mistake long repeated and chooses not to repeat it again. The night feels lighter here. The corridor opens into something less confined, less structured. The walls recede. The path widens. The twisted marriages that once defined power now exist only as memory, heavy, instructive, but no longer controlling the present. You stand in that openness for a moment, feeling the distance travelled, from gods marrying gods, to siblings bound by destiny, to families shaped by fear, to individuals choosing freely. Thousands of years compressed into understanding. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle history rarely advertises, that humanity can learn, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. As you move forward, the story prepares to soften. The urgency fades. The need to explain diminishes. What remains is awareness, calm, steady, and grounding. The past has spoken. The present has listened. And now the night begins to slow, preparing for rest. You move forward, and the world grows quieter still. not with emptiness, but with reflection. This part of the journey feels like standing at the edge of sleep, where thoughts soften and memories blur into feeling. The urgency that once drove kings, queens, and empires has faded, leaving behind something gentler, the echo of lessons learned too slowly, but learned nonetheless. Here, history no longer demands your attention. It simply sits beside you, waiting to be understood. The stories of twisted marriages, of bloodlines closing in on themselves, no longer feel shocking in the way they once did. Instead, they feel heavy with inevitability. You can sense how easily humans fall into patterns when fear guides decision-making, how quickly protection becomes confinement, how often survival instincts, when left unexamined, turn inward and begin to harm what they were meant to preserve. You notice how the night seems to breathe differently here. The pace slows. The images soften. Faces from earlier sections drift back through your mind, rulers shaped by duty, children burdened by inheritance, families convinced that continuity required sacrifice. None of them appear monstrous now. Only human. That realization settles gently, because understanding does not erase harm, but it reframes it. It allows compassion without denial. It acknowledges suffering without needing villains. You think about how often people throughout history believed they were doing the right thing, how certainty can be comforting even when it is wrong, how systems built on fear rarely announce themselves as such. They present as protection, order, stability. The marriages between siblings, cousins, and close kin were not born from desire for cruelty. They emerged from terror of loss of power, loss of identity, loss of meaning. And fear, when unchallenged, can justify almost anything. You sense how deeply this pattern resonates beyond royalty. While crowns and palaces magnified it, the instinct itself is universal. Humans everywhere cling to what feels familiar when the world becomes uncertain. Families close ranks, traditions harden. Change feels dangerous. The difference, now, is awareness. The modern world does not pretend immunity from repeating mistakes, but it possesses something earlier centuries lacked, the ability to pause and ask why. That pause matters. You feel how history's long night has taught that preservation without reflection leads to stagnation, that love without choice becomes obligation, that power without empathy becomes isolation. These truths do not arrive dramatically. They seep in slowly, through generations who look back and quietly decide to live differently. The dynasties that once believed themselves eternal now exist mostly as names, museums, genealogies. Their legacies are studied rather than obeyed, their mistakes examined rather than repeated. There is something comforting in that. The past has not been erased, it has been placed gently on a shelf, accessible, visible, but no longer controlling the room. You think about how families today still care deeply about heritage, tradition, continuity. These impulses have not disappeared, nor should they. Roots matter, stories matter, connection matters, but the difference now is choice, to choose tradition rather than inherit it blindly, to honour the past without living inside it, to love family without sacrificing individuality. That balance is fragile, but possible. You feel the story loosening its grip as it approaches rest. The intensity that once pressed against you fades into something warm and reflective. The twisted marriages that once defined power now serve a quieter purpose, reminder, a signpost marking where fear can lead when unchecked. And reminders, unlike commands, allow freedom. You think about the individuals who lived inside those systems, the ones who never knew alternatives, who acted within the boundaries of their time. They deserve remembrance without ridicule. Because had you been born there, raised there, taught the same truths from infancy, you might not have questioned them either. That humility settles softly. History is not a gallery of mistakes made by others. It is a mirror showing what humans are capable of, for better or worse, when certainty replaces curiosity. The night deepens gently now, not dark, but calm. The story no longer pushes forward, it rests. You realise that what began as a tale of taboo has become something else entirely, a meditation on power, fear, and the long journey toward understanding. The corridor you've been walking through opens into stillness. No more doors waiting to be opened. No more dynasties demanding explanation. Only space. You breathe slowly, feeling how far you've travelled without moving at all. Thousands of years passed not in chaos, but in steady unfolding, each generation responding to the last, sometimes repeating, sometimes correcting. Progress, you see now, is rarely heroic. It is quiet, incremental, often invisible until centuries later. And yet, it accumulates. The fact that sibling marriage now feels unthinkable is not because humanity suddenly became wiser overnight. It is because wisdom gathered patiently, mistake by mistake. That thought carries comfort. It suggests that even now, in your own time, confusion and contradiction may someday resolve into clarity, not quickly, not neatly, but eventually. You don't need to solve history tonight. You don't need to judge it. You only need to let it settle. The past has spoken, the lesson has been heard, and now there is nothing left to carry forward except awareness, light enough not to weigh you down. The night grows softer around you, like a blanket pulled gently higher. Thoughts slow. Images blur at the edges. You are no longer walking through time. You are resting beside it. You move forward one last time, and the world no longer feels like a corridor at all. There are no walls now, no portraits watching, no crowns waiting to be lifted. The story has thinned into atmosphere, a sense rather than a sequence. What remains is not history pressing in, but history settling down beside you, finally quiet enough to listen instead of speak. The long chain of marriages, traditions, fears and beliefs no longer feels tangled. It feels complete. Not resolved in a triumphant way, but finished in the way a long night ends, not with drama, but with softness. You realise that what once seemed twisted was never about shock alone. It was about humans trying to outwit uncertainty, trying to protect what they feared losing most, trying, again and again, to make permanence out of something fragile. Power, identity, family, meaning. For thousands of years, people believed these things could be preserved by closing inward, by repeating what had already worked once, by guarding blood as though it were memory itself. And for a time, it worked. That truth matters too. Empires rose, cultures flourished. Stability existed where chaos might have taken hold. These systems were not born from ignorance, but from limited understanding, the best answers available at the time. What failed them was not intention, but inflexibility. When the world expanded, the systems did not, and so the cost accumulated quietly, patiently, until it could no longer be ignored. You feel no need to judge those people now. Judgment feels unnecessary at this distance. What remains instead is recognition of how easy it is to confuse safety with confinement, tradition with truth, familiarity with wisdom. You think about how often humans still do this, even now. Not with bloodlines or crowns, but with ideas, identities, habits. The instinct is the same. When afraid, we close ranks. We protect what we know. We resist change, even when it harms us slowly. History's most twisted marriages were not anomalies. They were mirrors. That realization doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels grounding. Because mirrors do not accuse. They simply reflect. And reflection is where growth begins. The story has carried you through gods and empires, through palaces and power, through fear dressed as certainty. But it ends somewhere quieter, inside understanding. You no longer see those marriages as monstrous curiosities. You see them as warnings written in human scale. Not meant to frighten, but to remind that preservation without compassion becomes cruelty, that tradition without reflection becomes trap, that systems built to endure must also evolve, or they calcify. You sense the night deepening again, but this time not with tension, with calm, with that gentle heaviness that comes right before sleep, when thoughts loosen their grip and meanings blur into feeling. There is nothing left to unravel now. The story has said what it needed to say. All that remains is to let it fade. Your breathing slows almost without you noticing. The images that once felt vivid soften at the edges. Palaces become silhouettes. Dynasties dissolve into names, then into echoes, then into quiet. You are no longer walking through centuries. You are resting at the end of them. And in this rest, something important settles. The understanding that humanity survives not by repeating itself perfectly, but by learning when to change. That mistakes, once recognised, do not define us. That awareness itself is inheritance, one far healthier than blood ever was. The past is not reaching for you anymore, it is lying down. The weight that once pressed against your chest lifts. The urgency fades completely. There is no lesson you must memorise, no conclusion you must hold on to, only the feeling of having travelled far and returned safely. Your body grows heavier against wherever you're resting. The room around you feels distant, muted, kind. Sounds soften. Even silence feels full rather than empty. The night wraps itself gently around your thoughts. And now, the final part of the journey begins. Not forward, but inward. You don't need to think anymore. You don't need to analyse or remember details. You've already absorbed what mattered. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let the story slip from your hands the way water does when you stop trying to hold it. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing is expected of you. The long line of history has paused, just for you, so you can rest. Breathing in, breathing out, slowly, steadily. The echoes of ancient choices fade into something softer, like distant waves you no longer need to follow. You are here.
You are safe, and the night is kind. Let it carry you now.